Welcome to our bite-sized episodes of the Cardiff Met Sports Coaching Hub podcast, brought to you direct from the CRiC Conference 2024. Enjoy this episode. Back to another bite-sized episode from the CRiC podcast. I'm joined this time by Andrew Higham. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Thank you ever so much for having me.
We'll start with introductions really quickly. So tell us a little bit about yourself, which institution are you here from, who you're representing, and tell us a little bit about how you've sort of got into your PhD as you are now.
Yeah, sure. So I'm technically a sport and exercise psychology and human sport performance PhD student based at Sheffield Hallam University under their graduate teaching assistant scholarship programme. So I obtained a scholarship through Sheffield Hallam, and that led me down the pathway of the PhD that I'm currently on. I had the fortunate opportunity to pitch an idea and then managed to achieve that scholarship. And the idea was all around how we come to explore and make sense of coaches' well-being, specifically within professional football context. And just for the way in which I got into the PhD was simply because my background was in academia, lecturing, and mainly higher education within further education, and there just wasn't that opportunity to do research, or there wasn't the time to do research, and it wasn't really promoted. So for me, it was a bit of a stepping stone, a bit of progression that I actually want to get involved in this and speak to people and get to progress a little bit of knowledge, not change the world, but add a little bit of something extra.
Okay. And any sort of coaching background as well? What's your sport?
So my background my sport is football. Always been football crazy since I was young. Did a little bit dabbling in coaching, mainly kind of like multi-sports and things like that, going into primary schools and secondary schools and delivering workshops and things. And also I have a little bit of background of delivering psycho-educational workshops in a football club, so with academy players as well. But coaching background, I wouldn't say I'm an avid coach per se.
Okay. And you said you had the opportunity to pitch the idea for your PhD, which is quite a novel experience for many people. Typically it's sort of a PhD is advertised and you apply for it. Where was the inspiration for the PhD? Where did the inspiration for, coaches' well-being come from in football?
Yeah, it probably stemmed from my master's work. So my master's work explored how coaches actually made sense of morality within football, the rights and wrongs of the game, gamesmanship, sportsmanship and things like that. And there were some stark comments made by some of the coaches around the culture, the kind of systemic nature of certain things going on within football and organisations. And it led me to the question that I sometimes say is, who's looking after the person, looking after everyone else? Players tend to be at the forefront of research and discussions, rightly so, but also the coaches who are the ones who are caring after them tend to be deprioritised in some instances or forgotten about. They're the ones who are given that care, but who's caring for them? And it just led me down, the original idea was around welfare of coaches, and then that kind of materialised more so into well-being, with some tentative links to mental health as well.
Okay, great. And you're here at the CRiC conference presenting a poster. And we've all had a good look at that poster over lunch, had a good conversation about it. One of the really fascinating things about your work is your use of photo elicitation. Mm-hmm. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that particular methodology and what's sort of emerged out of that, using that approach, because you find it was really interesting.
Oh yeah, thank you. Photo elicitation, for myself, it was mainly an auto-driven approach. So photo elicitation, in traditional means, typically could be, let's say I'm the interviewer and you're the interviewee, and I might bring my own pictures as a researcher and slide them in and use them as prompts. Whereas what I wanted to do was empower the participants. The kind of culture within men's football is quite masculine, don't want to show vulnerability, inhibit or suppress emotions and expressive behaviours. So how could we empower these coaches to talk around their well-being, to maybe demonstrate some of those emotive expressive behaviours? So what that led to is that they would go and source their own images. So it could be taking them on their smartphone, literal images, to maybe using some copyright-free images that spark some abstract nature. And they would bring them to the interview, I would share them, and then just say, okay, so how does that capture and represent your well-being? And it just opened the floodgate, and then we could use those as prompts and divulge and enrich the conversation from there, really.
Perfect. And you've shared a few of the photos on those poster presentations, and also sort of spoke us through how some of the use of those photos progressed as the study sort of gone on, if you like. So can you tell us a little bit about how the participants have maybe started with a particular kind of photo and that's changed as time has gone on?
Yeah, so that was quite the case for quite a few of the coaches, where by behaviour started to change, maybe self-awareness increased. A core example was there was a first team coach whose time point 1 and time point 2, so for context, we did this across a season. So beginning of season, some midpoints, and then concluding points. And for instance, this coach, quite traditional in their way, really football focused, their identity was being a football manager, and their pictures started off in the sense of just all football orientated. And then as we discussed and spoke more openly, and maybe the coach showed a bit more vulnerability in that sense, their self-awareness increased, and they started to realise that family was a core foundation for their well-being. And time points 3 and 4 onwards then started to show more family-orientated images, pictures with this child doing hobbies, things like that. And it still had a little bit of football focus, but it went more broader. So how their well-being maybe flourished or thrived from engaging in wider systems than just that one micro system of being in a football club.
And you had that particular coach you're talking about there had some really positive feedback about just engaging with that methodology in terms of how he was thinking about his well-being.
Yeah, I can't really quote it word for word right now, but it was along the lines of the use of visual stimuli, so the use of images are really powerful tools. The coach mentioned how he never had the opportunity to speak so openly and honestly. It felt like he'd not had those genuine conversations before, to the point where he's become more self-aware of his emotions, the emotions of people around him, and how that maybe shapes general well-being states.
Yeah, absolutely. But there's quite a lot of contrast as well with the photos in terms of how they're being used. Like you say there, some are coming from their lived experience, out for dinner with a family and things. Others using them slightly more metaphorically. So the climbers on the mountain.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about that coach and how she'd sort of approached that choice of photo?
Yeah, so throughout the study we had 8 participants, 7 men and 1 woman, and this was a woman operating in men's professional football within a club. And this coach didn't supply any literal images, so taken from their own phone, but actually supplied copyright-free, more abstract images. And as you've alluded to, one was of the mountaineers climbing up the mountain. And that was a real insight into the challenges and the brutal nature of being a woman coach within that men's domain, how they are quite marginalised and quite isolated, and the brutal nature of the snow hitting them. They've got all the gear on, they're trekking up. And the fact that she said the people in the distance is also her trying to show up progressing up. We had the conversation of what's at the top of the mountain. It's the male counterparts, the male coaches. I want to get on that level. That's why I'm doing a UEFA A license. So it just shows that the way in which images can be supplied can really enrich those discussions to the point where it might illuminate those tacit or latent experiences that maybe not would have come up in a normal, traditional conversation. The fact that an image there could prompt that was quite insightful.
Yeah, absolutely. And those photos, what we discussed earlier, seeing them in publication form
Yes.
Would be a really nice way of opening up interpretation space for the reader as well, and it really adds some sort of value to the paper as well. That brings some challenges with it, of course. Number one, just in terms of squeezing it into the formatting, depending on the journal you're going for, but also, and I think this is the really interesting point, about ethics and about how you particularly when you're using that sort of auto elicitation approach with coaches sending in their own photos of themselves with family members. What can you blur? What can't you? What gives away identity, etc. Yeah. How have you managed that as a researcher for this?
Yeah, great question. And it's one of those that we had a discussion, as you mentioned earlier, and the pitfalls and trepidations with that. But as any kind of practice, you obtain ethical approval, you ensure everything's in place, and the information sheet did specify that you are giving consent for these images to be used in publication, at conferences. However, we will endeavour to maintain confidentiality, anonymity, and blur images where possible. But as we were alluding to in our conversations, there's the dilemma there of the richness of leaving it as it is and getting consent, and hopefully then being more open to that and seeing the facial expressions. It creates a more fuller picture than just a blurred image. But then also for me, it's one of those where I wouldn't want to break an ethical, practices, in the sense of, we spoke around how the club colours are identifiable. There might be a badge that's quite easy to see, and the struggles with and the challenges that come with that, it's a tricky place to navigate. So I think it's one of those where we had a discussion about, could it be one of those where you go back to the coaches and maybe seek a little bit of confirmation as to whether they're happy to. But it's when it comes to these sensitive topics, and I know it's not the most sensitive, but well-being linked to mental health, there's challenges with that. So it's whether they're willing to have those stories and narratives told more openly. Yeah, were they only as open with me because it was confidential? That's something that's played on my mind as well.
Yeah, and one last thing, because we're coming back around to the topic area, which is well-being. how have you been conceptualising wellbeing in this? That was something I found really interesting about your poster as well.
Yeah, so I know it's a short snippet this, so we could go on forever, but traditionally it's more seen as psychological in the sense of a state of being happy, healthy, and comfortable, arguably psychologically and physically. Traditionally, like hedonia and eudaimonia that comes under that. But the way in which I've tried to take it is more so the being element, that we are human beings and we are always situated within context, everydayness, that we're always going to have some spatial temporal relationship and how we interact with that. So it can be intrapersonal, interpersonal, that it could be transactional, emotional contagion can come into it. It's a little bit messy, but I'm slowly starting to unravel that kind of person in context, their life world interaction with wellbeing from a phenomenological perspective.
Great. And just to wrap up then, we are at CRiC and we're doing this bite-sized podcast about CRiC. Mm-hmm. What's sort of been what's been the best thing about CRiC this weekend for you? What are the positives that have come out of being able to present your work to a community like this?
Yeah, presenting work is always fantastic, and to get those connections and have those questions afterwards. But for me, it's more so just the general culture and the environment of meeting people like yourself, networking, and just having the opportunity to have these discussions, really. I'm an introvert naturally, so I find it hard sometimes to do that. But when you actually have those meaningful conversations, I was, this might be a bit random, but went for lunch and sat down with some of the people that I was presenting with, and then another member joined, and we were having a conversation about how there's challenges with PhDs, phonological approach, and you just have these natural conversations that just roll off the tongue, and it reassures you that what you're doing probably is right, and there's always going to be contrasting opinions, but it's just how research progresses. So for me, it's been great to be here and just meet like-minded people and have those discussions, really.
Nice point to finish. We're really grateful for you taking that extra little bit of time. You've been waiting outside patiently for us to get around to you. So really grateful for you coming in and sharing your research with us. And for everyone listening, the poster presentations and everything will be on the CRiC website later on down the line. We'll add some links to the description of the podcast for everyone to access. Andrew, thank you for your time once more, and all the best with the rest of the PhD.
No, thank you ever so much.
Thanks for listening. If you want to know a little bit more about CRiC, head to the website at cricsportcoaching.com, and you can follow along on Twitter as well at cric_SCR.